If you have ever looked up at the night sky and felt a quiet pull you could not explain, a sense that the darkness above was not empty, but attentive, you are sharing an instinct as old as humanity itself. Long before writing, before cities, before agriculture, the earliest human stories began not on the ground but overhead, in the slow movement of stars and the vast silence beyond them. What is striking is that these first stories were not centered on abstract gods hurling lightning or symbolic sun chariots, but on beings described as coming down, walking among people, teaching skills that seemed far beyond the reach of small hunter-gatherer groups, and then leaving again. The unsettling part is not any single story, but the pattern. Across every inhabited continent, cultures separated by oceans and tens of thousands of years remembered remarkably similar events using different names, different art styles, and different languages, yet describing the same types of figures, the same kinds of arrivals, and the same promise to return. These traditions appear in North America, South America, Africa, Australia, Europe, and Asia without clear exceptions, and they persist in the oldest layers of human memory, before large-scale travel or known cultural contact could explain the similarities. Whether one interprets these accounts as literal encounters, symbolic myths, or distorted memories of forgotten catastrophes, the repetition itself demands attention. When human beings first learned how to preserve memory beyond a single lifetime, they painted it onto cave walls, carved it into stone, and told it to their children with the warning not to forget. Those early records suggest a moment when something profound disrupted ordinary life, something tied to the sky, something remembered as global rather than local. In this calm exploration, there is no need to rush toward conclusions or declarations of belief. Instead, we will move slowly through the echoes that survived ice ages, floods, and the rise and fall of civilizations, noticing what repeats and what refuses to fade. Because whether these stories describe visitors, survivors, teachers, or metaphors, they reveal something deeply human. From the very beginning, we have looked upward not only for light and time, but for meaning, guidance, and the feeling that we were never entirely alone under the stars. To understand why these sky-centered stories feel so persistent, it helps to begin not with belief, but with images, because images often outlast languages and empires. Across the world, archaeologists have identified more than 100,000 rock art sites, many created tens of thousands of years ago, long before organized states or formal religions existed. The earliest layers of this art are not dominated by kings, wars, or even detailed daily life, but by repeated human-like figures that feel oddly out of place. Tall bodies, disproportionately large heads, simplified or absent facial features, and shapes surrounding the head or body that suggest halos, helmets, or enclosed spaces. In several regions, these figures appear to float, hover, or stand within rings, ovals, or translucent outlines, as if separated from the ground itself. Modern viewers naturally project modern ideas onto these forms, seeing technology where ancient artists may have intended ritual costume, spirit imagery, or symbolic exaggeration. Yet the fascination lies in how consistently these same visual elements appear in places that had no known contact with one another. In the Central Sahara, paintings once created in what was then a green savanna depict towering figures looming over much smaller humans, their heads perfectly round, their bodies decorated with dots, lines, and appendages that do not resemble animal skins or woven cloth. In parts of southern Europe, prehistoric carvings show figures with square or circular shapes around the head, sometimes emitting lines or rays, long before halos became a standard religious symbol. In northern Australia, ancient rock art portrays pale, wide-eyed beings whose heads seem emphasized far more than their bodies, embedded within traditions that say these figures arrived during a formative age when the land itself was shaped and ordered. The artists who created these images worked carefully, deliberately, often repainting or maintaining them across generations, suggesting that accuracy mattered more than decoration. From a calm distance, it becomes clear that these were not casual drawings made to pass time, but intentional records of something considered important enough to anchor memory itself. Whether these figures represent spirits, ancestors, altered states of consciousness, or encounters remembered through symbolic language, they reveal a shared human response to the unknown. When confronted with something overwhelming, unfamiliar, or transformative, people try to capture its essence in a form that can survive them. Stone, pigment, and repetition become tools of remembrance, allowing a single moment, real or perceived, to echo far beyond the lives of those who first witnessed it. When these images are paired with spoken traditions passed quietly from generation to generation, the picture grows deeper and more complex. Across many ancient cultures, stories describe not only figures that looked different from ordinary humans, but encounters that unfolded during moments of crisis, transition, or renewal. In parts of North America, there are accounts of non-human helpers who appeared during times when the world was changing or breaking apart, guiding selected groups to shelter, teaching them how to endure scarcity, preserve food, and wait until the land could sustain life again. These beings are remembered not as distant gods, but as teachers who interacted directly, communicated without raised voices, and departed once their task was complete. In West Africa, carefully preserved traditions speak of culture bringers associated with water, sky, and cyclical time, remembered through precise ritual calendars and symbolic diagrams traced into sand and stone. These stories often include details that feel strangely concrete: a loud arrival, heat or wind at the moment of descent, objects that spun or shimmered, and communication that did not rely on spoken language alone. Similar motifs appear in Australian Aboriginal traditions, where ancestral figures are said to have come down during a formative age, reshaping rivers and hills, laying down laws, and imprinting their presence directly onto the landscape before returning upward. What is striking is not simply that such stories exist, but that they persist with remarkable consistency in tone and structure. They are not told as fantasies or metaphors meant to entertain, but as inherited knowledge, often accompanied by strict rules about who may hear them, when they may be spoken, and how they must be remembered. From a gentle perspective, it becomes clear that oral memory serves a different purpose than written history. It preserves meaning rather than dates, experience rather than chronology. Details shift, names change, and imagery adapts to local environments, yet the core pattern remains intact, like a melody played on different instruments. Whether these accounts encode real events filtered through myth, psychological archetypes shaped by shared human cognition, or echoes of environmental catastrophes that force people to reinterpret survival as divine intervention, they reveal a common instinct to frame disruption as guidance rather than chaos. In telling these stories softly, slowly, people remind themselves that they endured before, that knowledge once arrived when it was most needed, and that the sky, whether literal or symbolic, has always been a source of both fear and reassurance. As the stories continue to unfold across different regions, a subtle timeline begins to emerge, one that quietly aligns with moments of profound environmental change. Many of the traditions that speak of sky beings, teachers, or watchers are set just after a period remembered as extreme cold, darkness, or flooding, a time when the world itself seemed unstable. Modern science now recognizes that near the end of the last ice age, Earth experienced abrupt climate shifts, sudden freezes, massive meltwater floods, and dramatic sea level rise that reshaped coastlines and erased entire landscapes. For people living through such upheaval, survival would have depended on rapid adaptation, shared knowledge, and cooperation beyond anything required in more stable times. In this context, stories of helpers arriving from above can be understood not only as literal encounters, but as memory frameworks that preserved crucial lessons. How to store food, when to plant, where to seek shelter, how to read the sky for seasonal change. In several cultures, the beings associated with these lessons are described as appearing after destruction and leaving once balance was restored, suggesting a narrative rhythm of collapse, guidance, and renewal. Archaeological evidence mirrors this pattern in an intriguing way. After the most severe climatic disruptions, there is a sudden appearance of agriculture, settled communities, and complex social organization in multiple regions, often with little sign of gradual transition. Villages become towns, calendars appear, monuments rise, and symbolic systems grow more sophisticated, as if humanity collectively stepped into a new mode of existence. Mainstream explanations attribute this to convergent innovation driven by necessity, and that may well be true, yet the stories themselves insist on something more relational. Knowledge is remembered as having been given, not discovered. In a calm, non-confrontational reading, these accounts may reflect how early humans understood the sudden arrival of transformative ideas during moments of desperation. When change comes too quickly to feel earned, it is remembered as a gift. When survival depends on guidance that feels external to one's own experience, it is framed as teaching from beyond. Over time, the human figures who carried that guidance fade, while the narrative shape remains, projected onto stars, ancestors, or visitors. What matters for our slow journey is not deciding which explanation is correct, but noticing how consistently humanity links wisdom, rescue, and renewal with the sky. In the deepest layers of memory, the heavens are not distant and indifferent. They are active, observant, and tied to the moments when life on Earth begins again, after nearly being lost. As civilizations slowly formed and memory hardened into ritual, the sky-centered stories did not disappear. Instead, they settled into the foundations of emerging cultures. Early temples, monuments, and sacred spaces around the world reveal an intense preoccupation with alignment, orientation, and timing tied to celestial cycles. Structures were positioned to face rising stars, solstices, equinoxes, and specific points on the horizon that only made sense when viewed across long spans of time. For people without modern instruments, this level of precision required sustained observation and inherited knowledge, carefully preserved and transmitted. In many traditions, the authority to build, rule, or teach was explicitly linked to beings associated with the sky, reinforcing the idea that order itself descended from above. Kings claimed divine mandate not because they invented law, but because they were said to maintain it on behalf of higher watchers. Calendars measured not only seasons, but sacred returns, moments when the boundary between worlds felt thinner. From a gentle perspective, this suggests that early societies understood stability as something borrowed, not owned, something maintained through attentiveness rather than conquest. When floods, droughts, or cold returned, the response was not only practical, but symbolic. Ceremonies reenacted the original teachings, stories were retold, and monuments were repaired or rebuilt to realign humanity with the larger pattern it believed governed existence. Over generations, the original figures blurred into gods, ancestors, or forces of nature, yet the core idea endured: that human progress was not isolated, but relational, dependent on forces beyond immediate perception. In a sleepwalking sense through history, this feels less like evidence of literal intervention and more like a mirror reflecting human humility. Faced with a universe vast enough to erase entire worlds of experience overnight, people learn to anchor meaning in something larger than themselves. Whether that something was stars, visitors, or the collective memory of survival, it shaped how societies understood responsibility, time, and the fragile continuity of life. And even now, when technology has replaced temples and satellites trace the same sky paths once marked in stone, the instinct remains to look upward for orientation, reassurance, and the quiet sense that the story did not begin with us and will not end when we close our eyes. Over time, as writing emerged and memory shifted from voice and stone into symbols on clay, papyrus, and bark, the sky-centered narratives became more detailed but also more formalized. What had once been fluid stories shaped by landscape and survival began to harden into chronicles, king lists, hymns, and instructional texts. In several early civilizations, the written record opens not with humble beginnings, but with an abrupt sense of inheritance. Laws are said to be received rather than invented. Calendars are described as restorations of older systems, and knowledge is framed as something remembered from a prior age rather than discovered anew. This creates a quiet tension in the archaeological record, because material culture often shows a sudden increase in complexity without long experimental phases. Writing systems appear already structured. Mathematics arrives with sophisticated base systems, and monumental architecture begins with proportions that imply advanced planning rather than trial and error. Mainstream scholarship explains this through lost precursors, social acceleration, and selective preservation, all reasonable and often convincing arguments. Yet the stories themselves insist on a different interpretation, one where humanity steps into civilization guided by an external template. From a calm distance, it becomes less important whether that template came from visitors, forgotten survivors, or accumulated insight compressed by crisis, and more important, that early people experienced it as something received. This perception shaped how authority functioned. Scribes wrote as caretakers, priests served as intermediaries, and rulers framed themselves as stewards of a borrowed order. Even skepticism becomes part of the pattern, because later generations repeatedly questioned whether their ancestors truly understood what they claimed to have inherited. Some cultures preserved this uncertainty openly, embedding warnings into myths about forgetting, misuse, and decline. Others masked it behind rigid hierarchies and divine absolutism. In either case, the sky remained the reference point, not merely as a physical space, but as a symbol of origin and accountability. When people failed, they did not blame flawed systems alone. They believed they had fallen out of alignment with something larger. In a quiet, sleep-oriented reflection, this suggests that ancient humans were less concerned with domination than with continuity. They lived with the awareness that knowledge could be lost, that the world could reset, and that memory itself was fragile. So they anchored meaning in the most stable thing they could see, the slow, repeating movements above them. Stars rose and set, cycles returned, and even when the ground betrayed them, the sky offered a sense of order. Whether the teachers of old were real beings, symbolic ancestors, or the collective imprint of survival, their legacy lived on as a discipline of attention. To remember was to survive. To forget was to risk beginning again in the dark. As these inherited systems spread and adapted, another quiet pattern emerged, one that often hides beneath myths and monuments. The idea of return. Many traditions do not describe the sky beings or teachers as gone forever, but as withdrawn, watching, or waiting for a future moment when conditions would align again. This expectation shaped how time itself was understood. Rather than a straight line from ignorance to progress, time was cyclical, marked by ages that rose, fell, and renewed. Festivals, prophecies, and long-count calendars were designed not only to remember the past, but to anticipate a recurrence. In this framework, decline was not failure, but a phase, and catastrophe was not an ending, but a reset. From a gentle perspective, this reveals how early societies coped with uncertainty, by embedding hope into structure. If knowledge had once arrived during chaos, it could arrive again. If guidance had once followed destruction, survival was not meaningless suffering, but preparation. This mindset appears in stories of watchers who observe human behavior, teachers who test readiness, and laws that must be maintained lest balance collapse. Over centuries, these ideas hardened into moral systems and eschatologies, but their emotional core remained surprisingly soft. They offered reassurance that humanity was part of a larger rhythm, not abandoned in a random universe. Even warnings of judgment or cleansing carried an implicit promise that someone was paying attention. In a slow, sleep-like reading, this expectation of return feels less like fear and more like longing. It suggests that people sense something incomplete about their condition, as if civilization itself were provisional. Tools improved, cities expanded, but the stories kept whispering that the true measure of success was alignment, not dominance. When societies became too rigid, too violent, or too forgetful, the sky stories resurfaced with renewed urgency, reminding listeners that the previous worlds had also believed themselves permanent. Whether interpreted as prophecy, psychology, or cultural memory, the return motif acts as a stabilizer. It discourages both despair and arrogance. The future is neither empty nor guaranteed. It is contingent. In that quiet space between certainty and mystery, ancient people learned to live attentively, watching the heavens not for spectacle, but for timing. And even now, when satellites replace stars as markers of progress, the old instinct remains. We still mark anniversaries, wait for signs, and imagine turning points ahead. The language has changed, but the rhythm has not. Somewhere deep in the human mind, the story is unfinished, and the night sky still feels like a place where answers might reappear, softly, when the world is ready to listen again. In the modern age, when archaeology, astronomy, genetics, and climate science began to intersect, the old sky stories took on a new and uneasy quality. Data that once seemed unrelated started lining up in subtle ways. Evidence of abrupt climate events, sudden population bottlenecks, rapid shifts in technology, and coastal regions now submerged beneath rising seas. None of this proves the literal presence of teachers from the sky, yet it reinforces something the ancient stories never stopped emphasizing: that human history is punctuated by sharp discontinuities rather than smooth progress. When entire ways of life vanish, when coastlines retreat hundreds of feet, when food systems collapse and are reborn, memory becomes fragmented. In those gaps, explanation turns poetic. The survivors describe what they experienced using the richest language available to them, blending observation, emotion, and meaning into a single narrative. From a calm perspective, this does not weaken the stories. It explains their resilience. Myths that encode real trauma, survival, and renewal tend to persist because they are useful. They teach caution, patience, humility, and preparedness. They remind listeners that the world can change faster than institutions can adapt, and that knowledge, once lost, is difficult to rebuild. As modern science uncovers traces of ancient floods, sudden cold snaps, and forgotten shorelines, the old narratives feel less like fantasy and more like emotional maps of catastrophe. The sky enters these maps not necessarily as a place of origin for beings, but as a symbol of scale, something vast enough to dwarf human plans and force re-evaluation. Even the more speculative interpretations, which imagine advanced predecessors or external guides, reflect a deeper intuition that complexity does not always arise from slow accumulation alone. Sometimes it arrives all at once, carried through crisis by those who remember how to begin again. In a sleep-oriented telling, this is not a call to believe or disbelieve, but an invitation to notice how ancient people processed uncertainty. They did not separate science, story, and spirituality the way we do. For them, the sky was a clock, a teacher, a warning system, and a source of comfort. When they said knowledge came from above, they may have meant that it came from beyond ordinary experience, from moments when survival demanded a wider perspective. And as we piece together fragments of deep history today, that perspective still matters. The night sky has not changed, but our relationship to it has become quieter, more distant. Yet beneath satellites and screens, the same questions linger, asking not who we are dominating, but how we endure, how we remember, and how we remain attentive in a universe that has erased worlds before, and will eventually do so again. When all of these threads are placed side by side, a final pattern begins to surface, one that is less about visitors or catastrophes and more about continuity. Across cultures, eras, and belief systems, humanity consistently framed its greatest leaps forward as acts of remembering rather than inventing. Agriculture was recalled as a gift restored after loss, laws as echoes of an earlier order, and wisdom as something once known and recovered rather than created from nothing. This perspective subtly shifts how history feels when told slowly. Progress becomes fragile, not inevitable, and intelligence becomes something collective, carried across time by stories, rituals, and shared attention. In this light, the figures who descend from the sky can be understood as embodiments of memory itself, appearing when forgetting becomes dangerous. They arrive at moments when human groups are small, vulnerable, and disoriented, and they depart once structure returns. Whether these figures were once living people elevated into legend, symbolic representations of rare individuals who preserve knowledge through collapse, or something more mysterious entirely, their function in the story remains the same. They bridge the gap between worlds before and after disaster. From a calm, sleep-like viewpoint, this reframing removes the urgency to prove or disprove literal interpretations. Instead, it highlights the emotional truth that ancient people were trying to preserve. They knew, from lived experience, that civilization could vanish quickly, that tools could be forgotten, and that meaning itself could dissolve if not carefully maintained. So they externalized responsibility, placing it in the sky, in watchers, in ancestors, who could not be argued with or ignored. By doing so, they gave their descendants a reason to listen. Even skepticism becomes part of this inheritance, because questioning is itself a form of attention. The sky stories persist, not because they demand belief, but because they refuse to be irrelevant. They resurface whenever humanity faces thresholds: climate change, technological acceleration, loss of cultural memory. Each time the language updates, but the structure remains. Someone taught us, someone is watching, something can be lost again. In this sense, the night sky functions less as a destination and more as a mirror. When people look up and feel that quiet pull, they are responding not only to stars, but to the weight of countless generations who did the same, wondering how close they were to forgetting what mattered. The calm lesson embedded in these stories is not fear of return, but responsibility during absence. Whatever once guided humanity, it is not present now in the same way. What remains is the task of stewardship, of land, of knowledge, of each other. And that task, ancient storytellers remind us, is never permanent. It must be renewed again and again, quietly, attentively, under the same sky that once inspired the first stories to be told at all. In the end, when the stories grow quiet and the details blur, what remains is not a single explanation, but a shared human posture toward the unknown. From the earliest cave paintings to the most complex calendars, people have acted as if they were participants in a much longer story, one that began before their own lives and would continue after them. The sky became the natural place to project that continuity, not because it offered easy answers, but because it endured. Stars outlived floods, ice ages, migrations, and forgotten languages. They became witnesses when no others remained. In a slow, reflective telling, this helps explain why so many cultures framed knowledge as something entrusted rather than owned. To believe wisdom was given was to accept responsibility for preserving it carefully. To believe watchers might return was to behave as if actions mattered beyond the present moment. Whether these ideas arose from literal encounters, symbolic memory, or the psychological need to survive repeated collapse, they served the same quiet purpose. They encouraged attentiveness. They asked people to notice cycles, to respect limits, and to remember that stability is never guaranteed. In a world where entire landscapes once disappeared beneath rising seas, humility was not a virtue, but a survival strategy. When told softly, these ancient narratives feel less like warnings and more like reminders. They suggest that humanity has always lived between knowledge and forgetting, between order and chaos, between confidence and vulnerability. Each generation inherits fragments, not wholes, and must decide what to carry forward. The night sky, unchanged in its patterns yet endlessly distant, offered a way to hold that tension without resolving it. It allowed people to rest their questions somewhere larger than themselves. As you listen now, perhaps on the edge of sleep, the value of these stories does not lie in proving who came from where, but in recognizing why we keep looking up at all. The impulse itself is the inheritance, to pause, to wonder, to remember that we are temporary and that meaning is something we maintain together. Long after fires fade and cities quiet, the stars continue their slow motion, and beneath them, human beings continue to tell stories, not to conquer the mystery, but to live gently inside it.